Well, I say this every time I think, but once again, it's been too long. Yeah, what are you gonna do? Anyways, today I'm gonna be talking very briefly about the Lethal Weapon film franchise. I know that there's a fifth one in the pipe, apparently. Don't really have any strong feelings about that one way or the other at this point. I don't need another sequel, but you know what? At this point, I'm gonna wait until I see the movie when and if it comes out. But I stumbled across the other four on Netflix a couple of days back, and not having seen them in a while, I just decided to give them a quick binge. So I just thought I'd go over the four movies really quickly and just share my thoughts on them. This isn't really a ranking. Spoiler alert, the first one is my favorite by a wide margin, and that's probably never going to change. But there were definitely things about the other sequels that I appreciated more this time round too. Okay, so first off, we obviously have Lethal Weapon, directed by Richard Donner. May he rest in peace. He would direct all the movies in the film franchise. And this particular one was written by Shane Black, which goes a long way in explaining why it's my favorite. Shane Black is absolutely one of my favorite writers. He more or less invented this whole sort of like buddy cop, odd couple coming together to work on a case kind of thing. But no matter how many times he's done it, he always makes it feel fresh. The characters are always different. No two characters from any of his movies are carbon copies of the others. I do kind of wish he had stayed on as a writer for the series, but unfortunately things didn't work out that way. This is also, in my opinion, Mel Gibson's best performance in the entire series. He has a lot of pathos here, much more considerably than he would ever exude in any of the sequels. And he strikes the best balance here, I think, between the humor and the grit that makes up the character of Martin Riggs. The scene where he hurls himself off a building with a suicide jumper handcuffed to him is actually a perfect example of that. In fact, it's using both those qualities to their best degree. And much more so than any of the sequels, the way that Mel Gibson uses humor to characterize Riggs in this movie feels much more grounded and natural. It's not as cartoonish and muggy as it sometimes gets in the sequels, like here, kind of along the lines of Bruce Willis in Die Hard. This feels like a level and type of humor that a real person might actually use in these situations to cope. Actually, in the director's cut, which I do personally recommend, there is a nice little scene where he picks up a prostitute, but then instead of actually propositioning her, he just invites her back to his trailer to watch the Three Stooges with him. The way that Mel Gibson plays the humor very understated and with just a note of sadness in the scene makes it actually very endearing. And then the prostitute's reaction to this new proposition to watch TV feels very sort of sweet and spontaneous and genuine. Instantly, she becomes that much more relaxed and happy to be with him. And it also effectively illustrates the depth of Riggs's isolation and loneliness in this first film. Gary Busey and Mitchell Ryan are both great villains. Maybe by today's standards, Gary Busey's a little bit hard to take seriously, but back in the late 80s when he was in films like this, he was astonishingly good. Like, he's so effective here. He is legitimately intimidating. It's also kind of fun to see Edo Ross pop up in a small actor role in this one. In fact, I think it's one of the few on-screen roles that I can remember of his where he actually gets to speak with his natural American accent. Most of the time they have him being a Russian. Red Heat, 6 Feet Under, things like that. The pacing is really on point in this one. We always feel like we're discovering new information right along with the detectives the whole time. And for every action set piece we get in this one, there are always reasons and consequences for it. And with Shane Black's influence as a writer, the plot unfolds the same way that all the best noir mysteries do, but with the action ramped way up. And the chemistry between Mel Gibson and Danny Glover works in this one very well. Probably, again, in my opinion, the best out of any of the films in this series. It feels like very genuine banter. Like, I guess what I'm saying is, compared to films that came further down the line, their humor is quick and witty, but it's not too quick. Again, it feels more akin to the kind of humorous conversations that real people might have. Unfortunately, as the series wore on, that would start to become a bit more cartoonish. But here it really feels like two different people getting to know each other and learning to work together. And neither man is perfect. Martin is obviously much more unstable, but you see plenty of Roger's flaws too. And because both guys make their roles feel so lived in, like right away, it makes it a lot easier for us to gravitate and really care about these two guys. And in this first movie, I find myself every time I watch it genuinely caring about them, like a lot. That is really what makes the big difference here, because the basic plot points and the whole business of the heroin smuggling, even in the 80s, that was already becoming a tired plot. But this film transcends that because it wisely foregrounds the relationship of these two characters and their story over the more mechanical story of the crime plot. So anyways, that's all I have to say about that one. First Lethal Weapon is my favorite in the series. Still, arguably, I would say one of the best bromances ever committed to film. So moving right along, we have Lethal Weapon 2. Richard Donner, of course, is back, but on this one, Jeffrey Boehm took over as the screenwriter, along with, I think, some other ghost writers and secondary writers that were at least consulted or something at some point. Like, this movie really went through the grinder as far as development was concerned. Shane Black, obviously, as we mentioned before, had written a script for a second Lethal Weapon movie, but the producers decided that they thought it was too dark, and they didn't like the fact that it ended with Riggs dying. Like a lot of people, I would love to see that version or even read the script, but at this point, I don't think that's going to happen. I'll keep dreaming, but I'm not getting my hopes up. But however it all happened, the ultimate product is that this movie feels much more cartoonish in tone than the first Lethal Weapon did. And watching them again this time, the shift between those two movies leaps out at me right away. Sometimes that does work. The scene where Leo Getz and Roger show up at the villain's office just to try to sort of fuck with them a little bit is very funny. You can tell that Danny Glover particularly is having a blast in that scene, because up until then, he hadn't had that many opportunities to really cut loose as Roger. Roger tends to be a little bit more uptight, so to see him get to kind of let it all hang out and be a little bit fun was actually, I think really refreshing. Probably a good refresher for him, certainly. As Leo Getz, I think that Joe Pesci is fantastic here, brilliantly cast. It's honestly, as famous as these movies are, I think one of his more underrated characters. And yes, I know that for all intents and purposes he is an iconic character, but I still don't think everyone really fully appreciates the full spectrum of Joe Pesci's performance in his first appearance here. I mean, he has to go between being sort of weaselly and obnoxious, fearful and cowardly, cunning, clumsy. With a lesser actor, this is a character that would be wildly inconsistent at best and probably unbearable to watch at worst. And as dumb as it is, I swear, I let out just a little "aw" in my head every time when we get to the point where Joe Pesci goes in and gives Roger and Martin a hug. Also, keep your eyes peeled for Hank from Breaking Bad, that is to say Dean Norris, in a small role here as a cop. I mean, geez, at this point, I think that Dean Norris has probably spent more time being a cop than a real cop has. And the other part of this movie where that cartoonish shift in tone does pay off for the better is in terms of what happens with the action in this movie. I mean, you've got the chase scene where the boat ends up flying through a windshield, the toilet bomb in Roger's house. Love the little moment that Riggs and Murtaugh shared therein where they silently admit that they love each other, by the way. I just think it's great work from both guys. The scene where Riggs collapses the villain's house with the pull cable on the truck, again, ridiculous, but it's awesome stuff. And no matter how zany or over the top any of the action gets, it's always choreographed very fluidly. Joss Ackland is another really solid villain too. He just has this effortless, malevolent presence and a constant scowl and brooding nature that makes it very, very easy and very fun to loathe and hate this guy. And lest we forget, diplomatic immunity. He has the same sort of collected smoothness and confidence that the villain McAllister had in Lethal Weapon 1, but with the menacing presence turned like way up. Now personally, I think that making his henchman turn out to be the one who killed Riggs's wife was a mistake. You would think that that would be a fairly important revelation, and it's not that Riggs forgets about it or misses it, but when you really think about the story and the amount of consequence that it has to it, not to mention the amount of time that Riggs spends really sort of wrestling with it or feeling upset about it, it's not really all that necessary. I mean, just take a couple lines of dialogue out with the henchman telling Riggs that, and it's gone. It's really not an important plot thread, and it's the kind of thing that if you are going to introduce it as a thread, should be. And then the payoff when he crushes him with that big storage crate just feels tonally adrift. Really the one time where the more cartoonish approach to the violence and action in this movie doesn't work in its favor. We're talking about Riggs finally getting revenge on the guy who is essentially responsible for pushing him off the deep end, and he just kind of pushes a button, crushes him, and he just kind of shrugs the thing off with a wink and a grin. Not saying that I just want to see Riggs being bogged down in depression and misery and loneliness and unhappiness forever, but given how much weight was invested in him as a troubled widower in the first movie, it feels a little bit like a finger in the eye to just kind of turn around in this one and be like, okay, never mind. And the whole subplot with Murtaugh's daughter being in a condom commercial is not nearly as funny as the movie seems to think it is. But all these sort of latter criticisms in this second one are things that I would probably just chalk up to the fact that there were too many cooks in the kitchen while they were making this movie. Too many people were involved in the writing process. I think, as I understand, they were even rewriting the movie while it was being shot, which is, by the way, a trend that would unfortunately continue into the third movie, but that's another story. And honestly, I still have to give the screenwriters and the filmmakers in general credit for finding a way to take all of that muck and form it into a movie that is still relatively cohesive. And I still give the filmmakers all the credit in the world for finding a way to pull all that chaos into something that actually feels cohesive, at least in terms of story, if not in terms of tone. So while Lethal Weapon 2 is a bit of a step down and not as close to my heart as the first one is, it's still undeniably entertaining, and it might actually have the most entertaining action out of any entry in the 4 films. So Lethal Weapon 3, still Richard Donner directing, of course. Jeffrey Boehm is back as the writer, or at least the credited writer. Anyways, I mean, if you just look up anything about the production of this film, about 1 million different writers tore through this movie like termites while they were making it. Actually, Carrie Fisher worked as a script doctor on this one as well. But much like Lethal Weapon 2, this one still manages to come out the other end being very cohesive and coherent, with action scenes that always drive the plot forward. I personally still feel like the parts of this story could be reconstructed to make something that was more compelling, like a real classic, but we'll get there. Lethal Weapon 3 might also have Danny Glover's best acting in the entire series. The whole subplot involving him having to shoot someone who turns out to be one of his son's friends, and then subsequently having to track the gun that was used in that shooting, and just the general effect that that has on Murtaugh emotionally and personally, and the ripple effect that it sends throughout his community and within his family. That whole aspect of the story in this one is so compelling that it almost makes me wish that they had started there and kind of made that more of sort of the focal point that everything else stems from. Especially because the gun does get tracked back to the villain in this movie, so it all comes out in the wash that way. And when Danny Glover gets mad and starts really cracking heads to try and find out where the gun came from, like, you believe his rage. You buy into his anger and frustration and pain 100%. It's also a nice way of flipping the table in terms of the dynamic between Riggs and Murtaugh, because this is one of the rare instances where Murtaugh is the one who's really flying off the handle and feels very vicious and dangerous, and Riggs is the guy who's more on the side, like trying to sort of keep him in line, saying, whoa, dude, just take it easy, calm down a little bit. But it's all happening for a reason that makes perfect sense for Murtaugh's character. Rene Russo comes in as Lorna in this one, of course. She and Riggs do pair up nicely together. I do like their chemistry. Much more so than Riggs's chemistry with the character Ricky in the second movie. That actress was just fine in her part, and she was a beautiful woman, no doubt. But in that one, she and Riggs were essentially just an item because. Lorna actually feels like someone that Riggs would be into. Just in general, I think Rene Russo doesn't get enough credit for how she's always able to take characters that on paper might seem like damsels in distress or bimbos and make them women who have a genuine sense of intelligence and character and just general fortitude that makes all the men around them a little bit unsure about what to do with their dicks. Or to put it another way, she's able to effectively upstage the men without making a big deal about it. There is a moment where she and Riggs stop to pick up a dog that's chasing their truck, and it is such a shameless recycling of a similar moment in Lethal Weapon 2 that it almost feels like a little bit of a ripoff, but what are you gonna do? That's kind of the territory we were getting into at this point, is that this was, less of a creative project or a creative pursuit like the first film was. and things, however competently made, were at this point kind of turning to just a bit more of a machine. Actually, Lorna's probably the only genuinely competent police officer that you see in this movie, and that's one of the criticisms that I have of it. I'm not sure if it was intentional. I don't really think it was, but there's something about the way that everything's been written and then, regrettably, I'm sure, rewritten many times, that ends up making all the police in this one come across as just not particularly competent at all. I mean, the movie opens with Riggs and Murtaugh blowing up a building like a couple of kids. They really only end up catching up with the villain Jack Travis in the first place because Joe Pesci's character Leo pops up at one point and says, "Oh yeah, it's that guy and I know where to find him." Then you have the fact that said villain Jack Travis is able to infiltrate police buildings not once, but twice, with such ease that it's just, I don't know, man. As cartoonish as these movies are, I don't buy it. First instance where he goes in to assassinate the survivor of the armored car chase, he literally just pretty much shows up, says, "Yeah, hi, I'm a cop, can I talk to this guy?" And in he goes, out he comes. Even though they catch him with a camera in the interrogation room that he didn't know about, there's a moment right after that where they're talking and they say that they've decided to revoke his credentials so he can't get into a police station again. And I'm thinking, like, okay, the slew of reprimands that you just finished telling us that this guy has, I mean, but besides the fact that that probably would stop him from getting all the way to lieutenant anyways, if he really was as much of a bad egg in the department as he's made out to be, are you telling me that that wouldn't have already been enough to revoke his credentials? The fact that he disappeared from a stakeout and was never heard from again up until now, that wasn't enough to make you revoke his credentials either. You had to wait until he just showed up out of the blue one day, walked into the police station and shot somebody again before you decided, okay, maybe we shouldn't let this guy get a pass with his badge and his ID anymore. Come on. Then later on in the movie, when he needs to infiltrate a police building again in order to steal more ammunition. And keep in mind, this is at the point where everybody is essentially on to this guy. They know that he's out there. They know that he's doing this at this point. He gets into this police station or whatever it was, the armory, something, by pretending to be asleep on the hood, I think it was, of the police captain's car. That's his big plan. He slumps over on a car. And it works. Again, I don't think it was intentional. It could just be that there was, again, too many cooks in the kitchen and not every thread got tied together effectively. But man, oh man, the LAPD come off as objectively the worst police department on the planet in this movie. It also doesn't help that the character Jack Travis is, well, let's face it, he's a boring villain. I don't blame Stuart Wilson, who plays Travis, because Stuart Wilson is a good actor. He's just playing the character as it's written, and it just seems to be one of those things that really suffered in the writing and the editing, because we really have zero reason to care about any sort of tension or confrontation between him and Riggs and Murtaugh. Honestly, all his scenes in this one, even his first scene in this one, it all sort of plays out as if we were already introduced to him in one of the previous movies. And if we were going to care about this guy at all, he probably should have been. We're going to introduce a character into the narrative like this. I'm sort of thinking, you know, why not make this the guy who killed Riggs's wife? It would give Riggs and Murtaugh both different but very personal reasons for wanting to go after Travis. In fact, the movie does still try to sort of do that, but in a very sort of like lazy, heavy-handed way by introducing a young police officer who, I think, if I remember right from the movie, had just turned 22 or something like that. And for reasons that I'm struggling to remember, I have to confess, ends up going along with Riggs and Murtaugh to pursue the villain at one point, and he ends up getting shot. And it feels like that was just kind of there to give sort of Riggs his own reason to be mad at this guy. Danny Glover even comes in right afterwards and looks at the cop's dead body and says to himself, "Oh man, another baby." Harkening back to his son's friend being killed, of course, and I guess that's supposed to kind of like, you know, bind the whole thing together. And within a couple minutes of this kid dying, he's essentially forgotten about. The stakes just don't feel personal for Riggs here the way that they did for Murtaugh earlier in the movie. Then you have scenes like the one where Riggs ends up interrupting a commercial or something like that that's being shot with Murtaugh's daughter. Feels like a scene that was written and performed on the spot and not in a good way. I mean, again, I have no direct insight into what this movie was like to make, but that feels like something that was just put in there out of desperation or some obligatory need to have a comic punctuation moment, or just some studio numbskull who insisted that there had to be a comedic beat every 2 minutes or something like that. Just in general, this third one, I find that there's lots of comedic moments that are only comedic moments. They're not genuinely funny. Joe Pesci's back as Leo Getson. There's a running joke involving him as a realtor that, again, much like the condom commercial subplot in the second movie, is not nearly as funny as everyone involved seems to think it is. All the banter and a lot of the comedy in this one feels like comedy beats for the sake of comedy beats. It's like the writers got overconfident in the charisma and presence of Riggs and Murtaugh and their chemistry, because it's like they think that, just about anything that they put in their mouths will automatically be funny just as long as they say it fast enough. Although I do like the banter between Riggs and Lorna. Again, Rene Russo and Mel Gibson do have very genuine chemistry here, and I do like their relationship. Some people have mixed feelings about that, but I like their relationship here. And again, much like the second movie, for being such a tossed salad of a production from everything I've read, I commend the filmmakers for managing to pull a very entertaining and functional movie out of all that chaos. So then we have a 6-year gap, and then in 1998, we finally got Lethal Weapon 4. Channing Gibson, no relation to Mel, takes over as the screenwriter on this one. But honestly, this movie could have been written by anyone. But before I go right to the complaint department, I will say a few nice things about this one too. It's definitely funnier than the third one. The humor works much better here, in my opinion. Bringing Chris Rock on board certainly doesn't hurt as far as that's concerned. And the scene with the laughing gas in the dentist's office still makes me chuckle and grin a little bit, even after all these years. This was also, I think, Jet Li's North American debut, and he definitely gets a few scenes where he gets to show off his skills well here. He kind of ends up stealing a lot of the action scenes that he's in, just because for the most part the action here, while it's still competently made, doesn't feel quite as sort of zealous or over the top in a good way as it did in the previous movies. The exception, and probably the full highlight as far as the action is concerned, is that chase scene in the middle where they end up plowing through an office building, and at one point Riggs is trapped behind one of the cars with a piece of plastic, I think wrapped to a table or something like that. That's the Lethal Weapon effect right there. However, I think it's also worth noting that this movie is a full 15 minutes longer than the theatrical cut of the first Lethal Weapon. And yet when I reflect on the two movies and compare them in my head, Lethal Weapon 4 does not cover nearly as much, either emotionally or in terms of just plot mechanics, as the first film does. I mean, there is barely a plot here. The whole business of the Hongs being smuggled into the US by the Triads literally just falls in their laps, essentially, when Murtaugh and Leo are out on the boat. And then the whole gang spends a good part of the movie essentially running around like headless chickens, until an Asian member of the Force essentially explains the whole thing to them. And really, as far as the story goes, I mean, that's it. The idea of Riggs coming to terms with the fact that he is aging and that he's not necessarily the titular lethal weapon that he used to be is interesting, but it really goes nowhere in the long run, if you ask me. The continued development of the relationship between Lorna and Riggs is sweet, but the parallel pregnancies with Lorna and then with Rianne, Murtaugh's daughter, I'm sorry, it's too much. I'm not saying that it's impossible that these two women could both end up pregnant at around approximately the same time, but for them to all wind up in the hospital like that together in sync, it's just, no, man. No. I can't do it. Plus, the relationship between Murtaugh and Butters, the Chris Rock character, feels very unfinished, because considering that he found out that Butters was his secret son-in-law this whole time, there's really not a lot of tension or resolution there beyond a light scolding. This movie continues the trend of the third movie by opening up with a comedic action scene that really has nothing to do with the rest of the movie. Well, actually, I'm sorry, I should take that back. At least in Lethal Weapon 3, there are consequences to that building blowing up, and that is inadvertently what ends up making them stumble onto the plot involving Jack Travis. So I'll correct myself there. But this one, there is really nothing to it at all for no good goddamn reason. The human tank, I think, is what the character is credited as, is just out on the street, shooting things and blowing shit up just because. You get to see Murtaugh running around in his heart boxers. Riggs shoots the valve on the back of the human tank and blows him up. And that's it. No backup really shows up at any point. There's maybe one squad car that pulls up amidst this whole thing. It might also have been kind of a fun scene to watch, even if it is a little bit gratuitous, had the trailers not given away the entire scene. I don't know if any of you remember this or not, but when the trailer started dropping for this fourth movie, the entire, I would say, first half of that trailer, if not 3/4 of it, is that opening scene. I mean, cut down a little bit, but really, like, it's the whole scene just given away in the preview of the movie. Just as a general rule, you really don't want to ever put anything from the first scene of your movie or the last in the trailer. And yeah, sure, I can remember grinning and laughing along with everyone else in the theater the first time we saw that scene in the trailer. But then it means that by the time you actually get to see the movie, the scene just feels completely redundant. And that's not a good note to start a movie on, like, ever. And that's really all I have to say about that one. The fourth one is unfortunately, not aging on me too well at this point. I seem to remember enjoying the fourth one when I saw it in the theater a lot more way back when, but hey, what did I know then? Now, I have heard that Mel Gibson and the rest of the cast apparently are back on board for a fifth movie. Richard Donner passed away in 2021, so obviously he can't direct this one, but at least according to rumor and a couple things I've read, it might be Mel Gibson directing it himself, which, I mean, that could go either way. But deep down, I gotta be honest with you, as much as I am gonna wait and see for the movie, I don't feel like it's one that I really need. I don't think it's one that anyone really needs. It's, a little bit along the lines of what my friend JT mentioned in his recent review of the most recent Scream film. I mean, we all love these old franchises. They're classics for a reason. Well, that's my opinion anyways. I'm not going to say that JT thinks that Scream is a classic, because if you know JT, you know he definitely doesn't. But my point is just, like, just let these old franchises die. Just let them die. Really. I mean, maybe I'll get lucky and Mel Gibson will find some way to give Riggs kind of the Logan treatment in this one successfully. But I really don't feel like there's any more ground to be covered here. Like, I mean, I don't know about any of you, but I wouldn't say that at the end of Lethal Weapon 4, my overwhelming feeling was like, this feels incomplete. I think I need more here. No. I got no problem with Mel Gibson still making movies and still doing action movies, but just do something original. Give us something new, something fresh. Especially if Mel Gibson is going to be directing himself anyways. I mean, he's talented enough to do that. But I have a sinking feeling that things are already in motion here, so I'm just going to hope for the best. If it's anything like other movies that Mel Gibson has directed that I haven't been crazy about, it might not be a masterpiece, but it'll at least still be entertaining in some way. Anyways, I think I'll wrap this one up here. Thanks so much for watching. Feel free to share your own feelings on the franchise down in the comments. You'll notice I didn't mention the television series at all. I might watch that at some point, but really that's one of those things where I have to remind myself constantly that it even exists. More content coming your way real soon, and I will catch you all later. Thanks for watching.